Shadow had never hurt a soul. He was the kind of dog that backed away from butterflies and whined when a squirrel ran too fast. But on that rainy Saturday morning when I tried to toss out a dusty, nameless box from the garage, he bit me. Not hard, not angry, just enough to stop me. Just enough to say, "Look again." That box, forgotten beneath a pile of tools, and time held something more than things. It held a map back to everything I thought I'd lost. To my father's voice, to my childhood's laughter, to memories I had locked away and buried beneath grief. Shadow remembered what I forgot, and somehow he waited. 11 long years to show me. This isn't a story about a dog, it's a story about how love remembers when we don't. And sometimes when we are too lost to find our way back, God sends us someone who never forgot the road home. Ash Grove, Colorado. Late autumn. Windy skies, dry leaves, and the scent of old wood smoke lingered in the air. The morning air in Ash Grove carried a chill that crept under your sleeves and settled somewhere in your bones. The sky above was a dull, overcast gray, smeared with thin streaks of late October cloud. On Maple Street, wind rattled dry leaves along cracked sidewalks, and bare branches whispered against the gables of quiet houses. Inside a small cedar-shingled home at the edge of town, Josh Langley, 42, ran a calloused hand through his unkempt, copper-streaked hair and stared down at the dusty cardboard box at his feet. Josh was a carpenter by trade and a solitary soul by circumstance. Once broad-shouldered and thick with laughter, he now bore the shape of grief, tall and lean, as if life had quietly carved away the unnecessary parts of him. His face weathered by sun, and silence held a quiet intensity, the kind of expression that told you he measured his words before offering them. His late wife, Marlene, had passed away 6 years earlier, and since then, Josh had poured himself into building things that didn't talk back. Tables, cabinets, fences, silence. At his feet, the box in question sat slumped against the garage wall, unlabeled, misshapen, and sagging slightly on one corner. He reached down, fingers tightening around the flaps, just as a low growl pierced the air behind him. Shadow was already there. The German Shepherd had appeared in Josh's life a decade ago, a gift from Marlene. After a failed adoption attempt left them with a broken dog bed and a heart still aching for a child that never came. Shadow was 11 now, his black and tan coat tinged with silver along the muzzle and legs. He had the dignified presence of a retired soldier, alert, steady, and reserved, but with a softness in his eyes that made strangers smile without knowing why. Shadow didn't bark unless it mattered, and he never growled. Until now. Josh froze. "It's just a box boy." Shadow stepped forward, placing himself between Josh and the trash bin. His ears were up, body tense, not hostile but unmistakably guarding. Then came the nip. Quick, sharp. Teeth brushed Josh's wrist, not enough to bleed, but enough to shock. "Damn it, Shadow," he barked, stumbling back. The dog stood, his ground eyes locked onto Josh's like twin anchors of something unspoken. He then lay down in front of the box, placing one heavy paw atop it, gaze unblinking. Josh backed away, rubbing his wrist. It didn't hurt, not really, but the gesture, the meaning behind it, shook him in a way nothing had in years. He went back inside and grabbed his phone from the kitchen counter. He stared at it for a few seconds before calling the one person he hadn't spoken to in weeks. Claire Langley answered on the third ring. She was 38, a museum archivist in Chicago, fiercely independent with a brisk tone and a heart she often tried to keep hidden under sarcasm. Claire had inherited their mother's wavy auburn hair and their father's stubborn jawline. She was taller than Josh by half an inch, a fact she never stopped mentioning during childhood arguments. Since their mother died, and their father a few years after Claire had urged Josh to sell the family house and move on. He hadn't. That was the thorn between them. "Josh," she said flatly, "I need to ask you something," he said. There was a pause. "This better not be about keeping that house again. No, it's not." "Well, maybe it is." She sighed. "What happened? Shadow bit me," he said. "Bit you?" "Well, nipped me. When I tried to throw out a box from the garage. A box I don't remember packing. No labels. Looked like trash." Another pause. Then softer. "Did he break the skin?" "No." "But Claire, he's never done that. Not even when he had a broken leg and I had to carry him out of the creek. What's in the box I don't know. He won't let me near it." Claire went silent again. Josh could almost hear her gears turning, sifting between practicality and curiosity. "I don't suppose you want to take this as a sign," she said finally. "A sign that the dog remembers something you don't. Maybe there's something in that box worth looking at." Josh laughed bitterly. "What, like a canine time capsule?" "Don't be an ass," she snapped. "Shadow's old. He's been with you longer than anyone. Maybe he knows what matters more than you do." Josh looked out the window at the garage. The door was cracked open, and inside Shadow still lay, watching the box like it held the keys to something sacred. "I'm not throwing it out," Josh muttered. "Not yet. Good. Maybe you're not as hopeless as I thought." Then, as always with Claire, the warmth ended abruptly. "Anyway, I've got a meeting. Call me if Shadow starts speaking Latin or levitates. Otherwise, maybe just open the box." The line went dead. Josh stood there for a long time, phone still in hand, the kitchen light above him flickering faintly with the gusts of wind outside. Back in the garage, Shadow didn't move when Josh approached. The dog gave a low exhale, heavy as wood smoke. Josh sat cross-legged on the cold concrete across from him. "I'm not going to take it," he said gently. "I just want to know, Bud." "Why?" Shadow blinked. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nudged the box forward with his nose. Josh stared at it, then at Shadow. Then slowly he reached for the top flap. Josh carried the box inside like it might collapse in his hands. The bottom sagged slightly and the corners were worn down to soft, pulpy fibers. Shadow followed at his heel, Step's deliberate ears still half perked, as though his job wasn't done yet. The living room of the old Langley house smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Josh set the box down on the faded rug beside the couch. Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves of the house. Late afternoon light filtered through the half-open blinds, casting quiet shadows across the floor. He sat down cross-legged on the rug, and Shadow lay opposite him, paws crossed, neatly, eyes never leaving the box. Josh hesitated. His fingers hovered above the lid, then pulled the flaps open slowly. The scent hit him first, something warm old and deeply familiar. Not the mildew he expected, but the dry scent of flannel and paper, layered with the faintest trace of tobacco and pine. Right on top was a scarf. It was red plaid, thick wool, the edges beginning to unravel. He recognized it instantly. His father's scarf. Thomas Langley had worn it every winter, slung carelessly around his neck with his heavy canvas jacket. Josh lifted it gently, smoothing the fabric in his lap. It was a physical memory, one that lived in texture and scent more than thought. Underneath, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a photograph. Josh blinked at it. It showed him and his father standing in front of the old truck. Josh was maybe 9, holding a wooden toy plane, grinning with 2 front teeth missing. His dad had one arm around his shoulder and the other resting on the hood. And beside them, at the very edge of the photo, a puppy with oversized ears and a wet nose. Shadow, just a few months old. Josh let out a slow breath. He hadn't seen this picture in years. Maybe never. Maybe it had always been packed away. At the bottom of the box, tucked beneath the picture, was a small leather-bound notebook. It was simple brown, with worn corners, held closed by a red elastic loop. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. The cover creaked as he undid the band. On the first page, in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. "If you're reading this, remember." Josh didn't flip the page. Not yet. He simply held the book as if its weight was more than leather and paper. His heart thudded slow and low. Shadow gave a soft exhale and placed his chin on his paws. The phone rang. Josh startled, nearly dropping the notebook. He stood and crossed to the kitchen counter where his phone buzzed and lit up Claire. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end. Then Claire's voice came through, quiet, cautious. "Did you open it?" Josh glanced back at the living room. The open box, the scarf in his lap, the notebook in his hand. "Yeah," he said. "I did." And he swallowed. Dad's scarf, a photo, and his notebook. Her voice grew even softer. "Do you remember the last trip he took?" Josh leaned against the counter. The question hit like a ripple in deep water. Something moved beneath the surface, but not clearly enough to name. "I don't," he admitted. "After the funeral, I don't remember much of anything. Everything just shut down, I know," Claire said. "You stopped talking. You stopped coming to Mom's room. You stopped being you." Josh didn't answer. The silence between them thickened. "I always thought it was strange," Claire continued, "that you forgot that trip. That he left so suddenly. And then came back so tired, changed." Josh glanced down at the notebook again. "Maybe he wanted me to forget," he said quietly. "Or maybe I wanted to." Shadow entered the kitchen, sat beside him, and looked up. Claire's voice cut through the silence once more. "If you read that notebook, and you find something you don't want to face, call me anyway, okay?" Josh nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Okay." Then the line went quiet. He hung up, returned to the couch, and opened the notebook. But he didn't read yet. He just sat there with Shadow at his feet, the scarf in his lap, and the first page open like a door waiting to be walked through. The morning after opening the notebook, Josh stood by the kitchen window with a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, staring out at the mist that clung to the edges of the street like a secret. Ashgrove was still asleep. The wind stirred brown leaves across the driveway. Behind him, Shadow sat patiently, tail sweeping the floor in slow, deliberate strokes. Josh turned and looked down at the notebook again, open to where he'd left off. The second page contained a simple hand-drawn sketch, a tree line, a small cabin, a lake shimmering behind it. Underneath, in his father's looping script, "If memory has a home, it's Silverpine." He hadn't heard that name in years. Silverpine was a mountain retreat 2 hours north of Ashgrove, cold in the winters, brilliant in the fall. Their family had spent a few Thanksgiving holidays there when Josh and Claire were kids, renting the same tiny wood cabin tucked into the hillside. After their mother passed, the tradition had faded, and after their father's death it disappeared altogether. Now it was back in ink and memory, and apparently it was where Shadow wanted to go. Josh packed a light overnight bag and loaded the truck with a thermos of coffee, the notebook, and Shadow's blanket. The German Shepherd climbed in without hesitation, settling into the passenger seat like he'd done it 1,000 times. His silver-tinged ears were alert, his posture calm but forward, as if he knew exactly where they were headed. The drive north was quiet. Josh kept the radio off and the windows cracked. The smell of pine rolled in, slowly richer with every passing mile. He passed signs for Cold Creek, then Pine Hollow, and finally a hand-painted wooden arrow that read Silver Pine Ridge, nailed crookedly to a birch tree. The cabin looked almost untouched by time. A small single-story structure with a mossy roof, narrow porch, and shuttered windows. The paint had long faded from forest green to gray, and ivy curled up the stone chimney like a slow whisper from the past. As Josh stepped out of the truck, Shadow leapt down behind him, tail raised. He didn't wait. He trotted straight to the porch steps, nose to the air, then paused at the front door, looking back at Josh as if to say, "Hurry." Josh retrieved the key from under the same chipped ceramic toad statue where their father had always hidden it, surprised it was still there. The lock creaked open. Inside, the air was stale, but not unpleasant. Dust motes swirled in the light breaking through the blinds. The furniture was exactly as he remembered: threadbare couch stone fireplace, wooden dining table with one leg that wobbled slightly. The cabin felt frozen in time. Shadow immediately padded over to a framed landscape painting above the fireplace, a watercolor of distant blue hills and autumn trees, and sat down staring up at it with quiet focus. Josh furrowed his brow. "What is it?" He walked over and gently lifted the frame. It came away from the wall with more ease than expected. Behind it, built into a shallow recess in the wood paneling, was a narrow envelope taped flat against the wall. Josh pulled it out. His name was written on the front in his father's handwriting. He sat down slowly on the arm of the couch and opened the letter. "Josh, if you're reading this, you've already started to remember. Good. You always thought memory was about thinking, but it's about place, smell, touch, the weight of a thing in your hands. This cabin, this was where we laughed without trying, where your mother hummed when she cooked, where Shadow found snow for the first time and panicked because he couldn't bite it." Josh chuckled softly. "What I'm leaving you is a map not of roads, but of what mattered. You and Claire need to follow it, not because of what you'll find, but because of what you forgot. Start with the tree. You'll know which one. Dad." Shadow nudged his knee as if in agreement. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Claire Langley sat on the hardwood floor of her one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by boxes of letters and photo albums. She hadn't looked through them in years, not since packing them away in a frenzy after the funeral. But something in Josh's voice the night before, low, uncertain, almost childlike, had opened a door she wasn't ready to shut. Claire was meticulous in nature. Her friends often described her as sharp around the edges. She had a short, precise bob haircut and wore pressed black blazers even when no one was watching. But today she was barefoot, her hair pulled back loosely, sleeves rolled up, hands smudged with old ink and paper dust. She sifted through a bundle of old letters from their mother. Most were mundane reminders to buy groceries, updates on Claire's college loans, but one envelope stood out. It was addressed to their father, but never sent. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink slightly smudged. "Tom, I know you're still thinking about Silver Pine. I saw the map on your workbench. I won't stop you. Just, if the kids ever find it, be kind. Don't let them carry your guilt." Claire stared at the letter, her pulse quickening. She reached for her phone and called Josh. He answered on the second ring. "You were right," she said without preamble. He was planning something. "I found a letter," Josh said. In the cabin, he mentioned a map, a tree. Claire's voice softened. "I think Shadow knows more than either of us." Josh looked down at the dog who sat patiently near the fireplace, eyes steady and waiting. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think he does." The morning air in Silver Pine was thin and bright, soaked in the scent of pine sap and wet leaves. The mountains around the cabin stretched out in soft blue ridges under a sky that was starting to forget winter. Josh stepped out onto the porch, Shadow close behind, and breathed in the crispness like it was something holy. The letter from his father sat folded in his jacket pocket, its words still heavy in his mind. "Start with the tree. You'll know which one." Shadow moved with purpose, trotting past the cabin's woodpile down a narrow trail that curved into the woods. Josh followed without question. The German shepherd's tail swayed rhythmically, and now and then his nose brushed the ground as if reading a scent no human would ever notice. They walked in silence until the trail opened into a clearing bathed in gold. In the center stood a towering sugar maple, its branches arched outward like arms caught mid-reach. The leaves had mostly fallen, but a few fluttered above like golden coins against the sky. Beneath it, the ground was layered thick with mulch and damp moss. It looked almost untouched, except for the slight disturbance in the soil near the roots. Shadow sniffed once, then sat down. Josh didn't speak. He knelt beside the dog and brushed the leaves away. His fingers struck something hard. A rusted tin box no larger than a lunch pail. It was wedged between two thick roots, wrapped in a fragment of oilskin that had long since torn. The lid creaked open with effort. Inside were several folded papers, a small compass with a cracked glass face, and a hand-drawn map. Josh pulled it out carefully. It was faded but legible, 3 marked locations: Silver Pine Cabin, Stillwater Dock, and the hollow tree connected by a looping red line. Each point was circled in ink, and in the top corner in his father's neat handwriting were the words, "Where Memory Lives." Josh sat back on his heels. The compass in the tin ticked faintly when turned. He held it in his hand and looked down at Shadow. "You were leading me here all along, weren't you?" Shadow responded with a quiet huff, then rested his chin on Josh's boot. Meanwhile, several hundred miles east, Claire Langley was driving westward through the flat farmlands of Illinois, her car's heater rattling faintly and the glove box stuffed with snack wrappers and a road atlas. She had left Chicago just after dawn, fueled by half-sleepless conviction, and 3 texts from Josh that morning. Claire, unlike Josh, was never impulsive. But the photo she'd found the night before, a crinkled Polaroid from the summer of 1999, had rattled something loose. In the photo, she stood beside her father, who was pointing toward a tree. Not just any tree, a wide arching maple with a notch in its bark identical to the one Josh had just uncovered. And beside them sat a puppy with oversized ears and bright eyes. Shadow, not even 6 months old. She couldn't remember who took the photo. Maybe their mother. But the image felt electric, charged with something she hadn't fully seen until now. Claire's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Josh had texted again. "We found a box. There's a map. Shadow took me to it. There's more." Claire didn't reply. She just pressed harder on the gas. By the time she reached Silver Pine, the sun was tipping toward late afternoon. The road narrowed into gravel, winding through the trees until the old cabin came into view. She parked behind Josh's truck and stepped out, brushing road dust from her jacket. Her eyes scanned the tree line. Josh appeared at the edge of the path, Shadow trotting at his side. He looked surprised for a beat, then smiled, awkward, hesitant but real. Claire hadn't seen him in person in almost 3 years. "You came," he said. "I brought something," she replied, holding up her bag. "Thought it might help." They sat together beneath the tree, and Claire pulled the photo from a book tucked in her satchel. Josh took it carefully, studying the way their father stood, arm outstretched, shadow in the frame like a punctuation mark. "I don't even remember this day," Josh murmured. "I do," Claire said. "You'd just built a fort behind the cabin. You insisted on naming it after Shadow. He barked and knocked it over before we could finish." Josh laughed softly. Shadow blinked at them both, content between them. Claire leaned forward, eyes on the map. "Stillwater Dock. That's the lake near the fishing lodge, right?" Josh nodded. "And the hollow tree. That was what that old redwood we used to hide notes in." Claire looked at the tin box. "You think Dad planned all this?" Josh shrugged. "Maybe not everything, but enough to lead us here." They sat in silence for a while, the maple's branches whispering above them. Claire turned to her brother. "I always thought you were the one who shut down after the funeral. But I did too, just differently. I left everything in boxes. I never even opened them," Josh admitted. Shadow shifted beside them, nudging Claire's hand gently with his nose. She scratched behind his ears, and for the first time in years, her eyes softened. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't need to. The map lay between them. And ahead, 3 places waited. Stillwater Lake shimmered beneath the waning afternoon sun, its surface dappled with gold and shadow. The shoreline was quiet, save for the creak of branches in the wind and the slow lapping of water against the old wooden dock. Time had not claimed this place. It looked just as it had 20 years ago, remote, worn, and beloved. Josh parked the truck near the edge of the tree-lined tires, crunching over gravel. Claire climbed out beside him, stretching after the long drive from Silverpine. She wore a denim jacket over a black sweater hair pulled into a low knot at the base of her neck. Her boots sank slightly in the damp dirt. Shadow jumped down from the truck bed, tail low but wagging. He sniffed the air, ears flicking as he turned toward the lake. Without waiting for either sibling, he trotted down the slope paws, silent on the pine needle path. Josh and Claire followed the familiar hush of the lake, settling around them like a memory they hadn't meant to wake. The dock jutted into the lake at a slight tilt. Its wooden planks, soft with age, groaned under their weight as they stepped onto it. Moss curled around the supports. A heron lifted silently from the reeds in the distance, wings wide and slow. Shadow circled to the far end of the dock. He paused at a rotting post, sniffed once, then sat down, staring at the space between the beams. His head tilted. Josh crouched beside him, running a hand along the underside of the deck. His fingers hit something hard, a small square cavity cut into the wood, skillfully concealed by a false panel. He worked it loose. Inside was a plastic-wrapped bundle sealed with decades-old duct tape. The shape was unmistakable of VHS tape. On the front, in their father's handwriting, faded but still readable for the days that need remembering. Claire knelt beside him, stunned. "Do you think it still works?" Josh nodded. Only one way to find out. They returned to the cabin just after dusk. The sky had darkened to indigo, and the trees whispered with a wind that smelled faintly of smoke. Claire pulled a small portable VHS player from her bag. It had belonged to her museum's archive room before it was donated to her home office. She had brought it on instinct, never expecting to use it so soon. The device powered up with a soft mechanical whir. Josh slid the tape in carefully. The screen flickered. Then came the grainy, unmistakable image of their mother, standing in front of the cabin at Silverpine, waving at the camera. She looked younger than Josh remembered, her auburn hair tied back in a red bandana, cheeks, flushed eyes crinkling at the corners. She turned toward someone off camera. "Tom, don't film the mess," she laughed. "Just film them." The camera turned, revealing young Josh, maybe 11, holding a marshmallow on a stick, and Claire sulking in an oversized sweatshirt sitting by the fire pit. Claire smiled faintly. "I remember this night. I was mad because I lost a board game." Josh chuckled. "You flipped the Monopoly board. Dad called you Hurricane Claire for a month." They watched in silence as the footage shifted, flashes of their father singing out of tune while flipping pancakes, Shadow racing through the snow like a streak of wild joy, their mother and father dancing on the porch one quiet night when they thought no one was watching. Then came the final clip. Their father sat alone by the lake, the camera on a tripod. He looked older here. The edges of his face were more tired, the lines around his mouth deeper. He took a breath, then began to speak. "If you're seeing this," he said, "then the dog found the box." Josh and Claire exchanged a glance. "I never was good at saying things out loud." But there's something I wanted you both to remember. I've made mistakes, kept too many things to myself. But I hoped, I prayed, that one day you'd come back to this place, together." He looked down as if searching for the right words. There's something about memory, it's not meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be shared. If you found this, that means you remembered not just me or your mom or Shadow, but each other. And if you're watching this, then I want to ask something simple. He leaned closer to the camera, his voice soft. Forgive each other, that's all, because the best memories are the ones you share. The screen went dark. Claire wiped at her eyes. He knew. Josh sat back slowly. He always did. Shadow lay beside the couch, eyes closed chest, rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The flickering glow of the player cast soft shadows across the room. Outside, the lake reflected the moon in a silver line, still and unbroken. Josh reached for the map again. Stillwater's done. Claire pointed to the next mark, the hollow tree. Josh folded the map with quiet care. Tomorrow, then. She nodded, and beside them, Shadow gave one soft, contented sigh like he too had remembered something worth keeping. The next morning dawned pale and windless. The trees stood silent as the fog clung low to the earth, a thick hush wrapping around everything in Stillwater. Josh poured 2 mugs of coffee, one for himself and one for Claire, who sat at the cabin table brushing crumbs from a map still creased from the night before. "The hollow tree," she said softly, tapping a faded circle on the corner of the paper. Josh nodded. "Just behind the elementary school, if it's still standing." It took them an hour to pack up and drive eastward. The town of Ashgrove greeted them like an old photo unfolded but slightly blurred. The building seemed smaller than they remembered. The grocery store now sold vape pens and energy drinks. The movie theater was closed, its marquee frozen in time with a film from 5 summers ago. But the school was still there. Ashgrove Elementary stood squat and square, its brick walls unchanged, the swing sets rusting quietly in the wind. The oak trees behind it were taller now, older, but not unfamiliar. Josh parked at the edge of the lot and stepped out, Shadow leaping gently from the back seat. Claire followed him across the playground. She wore a gray peacoat and dark jeans, her expression unreadable, as she glanced toward the spot where the old tire swing used to hang. The school bell, once a symbol of boredom and finality, now echoed only in memory. Behind the far fence was the trail they used to take the secret way through the woods where they'd ride their bikes or build forts. The trail was overgrown now, but the shape of it remained. It twisted left at the gnarled pine and dipped behind a cluster of sumac. And then they saw it. The hollow tree. It was massive, even by childhood standards. Its trunk split at the base like an open mouth. Bark curled at the edges. Moss covered one side in a velvet-like film. Its hollow center was large enough for 2 small kids or 1 adult bent at the waist. Shadow padded forward without hesitation and sat in front of the hollow tail, thumping once, his eyes fixed on the darkness inside. Josh crouched, squinting into the tree. He reached in and felt the cold touch of tin. With a little effort, he slid the object free. It was an old cookie tin, once red and white, now mottled with rust. The lid stuck briefly, then popped loose. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were a stack of folded drawings, a pair of dried-up markers, and a single rolled-up page sealed with a rubber band. Josh sat back on his heels, unfolding the papers one by one. They were his drawings he hadn't seen in over 20 years. Stick figures, childish but earnest. One of Shadow, with huge paws and a superhero cape. One of their family in front of the cabin, everyone holding marshmallows. One showed a house with smoke curling from a chimney, hidden deep in the woods surrounded by animals. "That was the tree house we wanted to build," Claire said, kneeling beside him. Josh looked up. I remember you drew it for Dad. Said you'd build it when you got tall enough to use real nails." He laughed, but it was soft, almost reverent. He kept them. Claire reached for the rolled page and undid the rubber band. It was the best drawing of them all, colored in carefully shadows, penciled in with purpose. It showed Claire and Josh standing side by side with shadow between them. They all smiled. In the corner, written in small, almost invisible letters, "For Dad, so he knows we're always together." Claire's fingers trembled slightly. Josh looked over at her, his voice low. "You never told me you remembered this place." Claire didn't look at him. She stared at the drawing voice barely above a whisper. "I used to come here after school when you were at baseball. I'd sit inside the tree and read, or just be mad." "Mad," she nodded. "Because you always got him. You got the long weekends, the garage time, the late-night movies." Josh sat still. Claire smiled, but it was sad. "I used to think maybe you needed him more than I did. And later, I hated that you couldn't talk about him after he died, like he vanished twice." Josh stared down at the drawing again. "I didn't talk," he said, "because I didn't want to break." They sat there, the silence full of everything that had gone unsaid for years. Then, without speaking, Claire leaned over and hugged him. It wasn't awkward or forced. It was the kind of hug that grows from silence and memory, from forgiveness too long delayed. Josh returned it, eyes closed, hand resting on her shoulder like a bridge. Shadow let out a quiet bark, as if confirming what had always been true. This was the place they had needed to return to. The wind had picked up by the time they returned to the cabin. Silverpine's skies had turned overcast, and dusk had begun its slow descent, folding shadow into every hollow of the hills. The cabin, though still and quiet, somehow felt different, like it had been waiting. Josh lit the fireplace while Claire placed the drawings from the hollow tree on the table. Shadow lay curled near the hearth tail, tucked, his breathing slow and even. He was sleeping more these days. His steps were slower. Josh noticed it in the way the old dog hesitated before climbing the porch stairs, or how he settled into the truck bed with a deeper sigh than before. Claire opened one of the drawers in the wooden sideboard, the same drawer their father always kept his crossword puzzles in. She paused, fingers brushing against a faded brown journal tucked beneath a stack of coasters. "Josh," she called, holding it up. Josh walked over, towel still slung over his shoulder from drying his hands. The journal was worn leather soft at the corners, the pages yellowed and curled slightly at the edges. Claire opened it gently. Most of it was filled with short entries, dates, lists, half-completed thoughts. But about halfway through, something fell out. A single envelope. Josh caught it before it hit the floor. On the front, in their father's unmistakable print for Josh, "Only open if Shadow's still with you." Josh sat down slowly. Claire sat beside him silent. He opened the letter, the paper thin and fragile between his fingers. "Josh, if you're reading this, it means Shadow stayed. And if he stayed, then you did too. That's more than I could have asked. There's one last place I need you to go. Ashlight Hill. You know the one. You used to call it the Watchtower when you were little. Hike up there, sit down, stay for a while. There's something I never told you about your mother, about where she rests, and about what love means when it's quiet." The words blurred slightly as Josh blinked back something behind his eyes. Claire didn't speak. She placed a hand lightly over his, the letter still between them. Ashlight Hill. It was a high ridge just outside of town, a steep path most locals used for morning hikes and summer picnics. Josh hadn't been there in over a decade, not since the summer before their mother passed. Back then, it had felt like a place made for wonder-wide skies, tall grass, and the kind of view that made everything feel just a little less heavy. They left just before dawn the next morning with a thermos of tea, a light blanket, and Shadow riding in the back seat, his head resting on the truck rail, nose turned toward the wind. The hike wasn't easy. The trail was steeper than Josh remembered routes exposed from years of erosion, and patches of damp leaves made the path slick. Shadow trotted beside him with effort, tongue lolling but determined. Claire walked ahead, focused and quiet. She had changed too. Softer now, less guarded, like the climb had peeled away the last layers of the city that had hardened her. When they reached the top, the view opened wide. The valley lay below them in full autumn bloom, ochre's golds and deep russet reds. The sun had just risen enough to burn the fog into wisps, and the sky was stretched in quiet pink. Josh spotted it first. A stone bench, half covered by wild grass and ivy, sat at the highest edge of the hill. He walked to it slowly. Carved into the backrest were the words, "For the four-legged keeper of our love." Josh ran his fingers across the stone, then sat down, heart full and strangely light. Claire found a small brass plaque beneath the bench. The engraving read, "In memory of Margaret Langley," scattered beneath these skies where she loved the light and the wind, and the dog who never left her side. Neither of them said anything. Claire crouched beside the plaque, tracing the letters. "He brought her here," she whispered. Josh nodded, and he came back. "With us." Shadow lay down in front of the bench. He didn't move, just rested his head on his paws and watched the sun rise without blinking. Josh sat in silence, staring out over the valley. He didn't just remember, he murmured. He guarded all of it. All this time. Claire sat beside him. He brought us back. They stayed until the sun was well into the sky, until the chill lifted from the air and the leaves began to dance in the wind. Shadow slept the entire time unmoving, except for his ears flicking at the sound of birds. Josh placed the final letter on the bench, folding it beneath a smooth rock. Then they walked back down the hill, Shadow between them, old, loyal, steady. The light in the cabin had changed. It was softer now, filtered through the last golden leaves clinging to the trees, outside casting warm patterns onto the wooden floor. Josh sat cross-legged in the living room, surrounded by open boxes. Each one held something returned, the red scarf, the childhood drawings, the faded photo of Shadow as a pup, the compass from the maple tree, the VHS tape now rewound and resting on the mantel, and finally the notebook. All of it had made its way back like birds returning to a roost before winter. Shadow lay beside the first cardboard box, the one that started it all. His breathing shallow but peaceful. His silver-marked muzzle rested across his outstretched paws, and though his eyes were half-lidded, they flicked open every now and then, watching Josh with that quiet awareness dogs carry when they know their work is almost done. Claire entered the room with 2 mugs of tea. She wore a dark green sweater over faded jeans, and her hair was tied in a loose braid that trailed over one shoulder. Her eyes, once sharp with worry, and distance, now held something gentler. She handed Josh a mug and sat beside him, knees brushing the corner of the scarf. They sipped in silence. On the table nearby lay the thick spiral notebook Josh had started 3 days earlier. He had torn out the first page 3 times, unsatisfied with every attempt. Now, a new one lay waiting beneath the tip of his pen, bearing the simple title, Shadow's Trail, a Memory Map. "I'm not writing it for anyone else," he said almost to himself. "Not for readers, not even for Dad." Claire nodded, then Josh glanced at Shadow, him and me, and maybe whoever needs to find something they didn't know they'd lost. Claire reached into the stack of drawings and pulled out the one of the forest cabin, the dream they'd once drawn in, secret a house tucked between trees, safe and open. "Maybe it doesn't have to be just a book," she said quietly. Josh raised a brow. Claire met his gaze. What if we made the cabin that place for real? For people who are searching for what they forgot or what they ran from. Josh blinked. Like a retreat. Like a waypoint, she said. We turn it into a rest stop. Not just for hikers and travelers, but for people walking through grief, through memory, through dogs that won't let them throw boxes away. Josh smiled deep and tired and whole. You already have a name in mind, don't you? Claire held up a small wooden plank she'd found in the garage earlier that day. Burned into its face with a wood burner were the words, "Where dogs bring you home." They laughed together, and for a moment the cabin held the warmth of every memory they thought they'd lost. Later that night the fire crackled low in the hearth. Josh worked under a desk lamp, the tip of his pen gliding across the page. He had finished the first chapter of Shadow's Trail, and though it wasn't perfect, it felt true. Claire busied herself by sketching cabin renovations in a notepad where to put a bookshelf wall, how to convert the back room into a quiet writing nook, what kind of chairs would work best on the porch. Every detail she planned was thoughtful, gentle, like she was building a space that could hold grief without pressing too hard on it. Shadow stirred, once shifted closer to the base of the couch, then settled again with a soft sigh. I don't think he'll be with us much longer, Claire said quietly. Josh nodded. But I think he knows he finished his job. The next morning the cabin was bright with the kind of light that comes after a storm, not loud but forgiving. Josh found Shadow already awake, curled in the same spot tail, thumping faintly at the sound of his voice. He wrapped the old red scarf gently over Shadow's back. They sat on the porch as the sun rose, watching the mist burn off the trees, the same way they had once done with their father. No words were needed. The wind carried the sound of birdsong, and the trees stood still like keepers of something sacred. That afternoon they hung the wooden sign above the cabin door. Claire stepped back, her boots crunching over gravel. Josh climbed down from the ladder, eyes squinting as he read the words aloud. Where dogs bring you home. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin with something as ordinary as a cardboard box, or a dog that refuses to let go. In Shadow's Trail, we learn that memory isn't stored in objects, it lives in love, in footsteps retraced in places once touched by those we've lost. Through every buried letter, forgotten drawing, and gentle bark, Josh and Claire found not just their father's legacy, but the thread that had always connected them, grace, forgiveness, and the loyalty of a friend who never left their side. And maybe that's how God works too, not always in thunder or lightning, but in the silent way a dog rests its head on your lap, in the way a tree still stands where you used to play, in the way a lost trail somehow leads you home. Shadow didn't just remember, he guarded, love carried it, and in the end handed it back to the ones who needed it most. And in that, we see the hand of God, gentle, patient, and always guiding. So here's the reminder, you don't need a map to go back. Sometimes all it takes is a heart willing to return. Forgive. Share the memories. Make peace. And never doubt that God can speak through even the quietest companion. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember. Leave a comment and say, Amen, if you believe that even a dog can be part of God's plan to lead us home. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and pray that those who feel lost will find their way just like Josh, Claire, and Shadow did. May God bless you and all the silent guardians watching over your memories.